In this episode, we are sitting down with Annie Murphy Paul, and it was a great honor and an intense pleasure to welcome Annie onto the show because she's an acclaimed science writer, one of the best, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Scientific American, Slate, Time Magazine, so many others. She's the author of Origins, The Cult of Personality, and her TED Talk titled What We Learn Before We Are Born has been viewed more than 2.6 million times. She's a graduate of Yale University and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and she has a new book out, just out, titled The Extended Mind, all about how the brain is part of a system, many systems, and it's those systems that constitute the mind. In other words, our minds are not, as she puts it, brain bound, but they extend to our computers, our notebooks, our friends and neighbors and colleagues and partners. The environments in which we move, natural and otherwise, deeply influence how we think, and what we can think. And in addition, everything the brain does becomes a reference for extended thinking, which means when we gesture our hands, those gestures then get rolled back into the next sequence of cognitions. And that's true for just about everything the brain puts out there. Output becomes input, becomes output. The same is true during a conversation, during journaling, writing of any kind, and so on. And these feedback loops extend the mind. We get deep into all of this in the interview and discuss many other things: neurocentric bias, brain-bound thinking, outdated metaphors, and we talk about a new metaphor, which is to consider the mind as if it is a thieving magpie. All of that and more. So let's get into it right now with Annie Murphy Paul discussing the extended mind. Hey, it's so cool to meet you. I think you're a fantastic journalist, and I love all the things you do in the world.
Thank you. I've admired your work for a long time, so this is a real pleasure for me.
Oh, that's great. All right, this is over. We're just going to go get a drink and talk how awesome we are. Uh, yeah, reading your introduction, I was like, yeah, this is good. Like, there's all sorts of things in there that I'm like, yes, I 1,000,000% agree with all these things, and these are also how I pay my bills by telling people this stuff in 3,000 different ways. I really enjoy.
Right.
I remember way years ago talking about just an alarm clock and a is an indication that you have bounded the brain is bounded in its abilities to be super smart. You need something
Yes.
to get you up, and then also, like, I have notepads everywhere. I have a notepad in the shower, which is part of my extended mind. I have one that you stick to the shower,
Oh, really?
and with a waterproof lead pencil,
So interesting.
and I take shower notes all the time. I have a pile of them over here. Uh, these are actual. I have actual shower notes that like this is a, you can see it's weird waterproof paper, and let me let's see what this one says. Biocentrism locusts enjoy destroying fields. I have no idea what that means, but I did write it in the shower one day.
In the shower, it seemed brilliant.
It's just to keep me from going nuts in there. Okay, Annie Murphy Paul, in Connecticut, across the information superhighway, part of the extended mind. Let me ask this. This is something I prefer to do here lately when it comes to book stuff, and I was leading up to that, trying to validate with you and commiserate with you on book stuff. What made you want to write this book? What was the incepting moment? What decide? How did you decide to put yourself through such a miserable and taxing process? Why did you want to do this?
Oh, and it was even more miserable and taxing than you can imagine, because it originally started out as a book about something completely different. And as you know, with books, they kind of have a life of their own and they tell you what they want to be. And originally I had started out writing a book about the science of learning, and I labored at that for a long while. And what I had at the end of it was kind of a collection of techniques more than a big idea that could pull it all together. And I'm a sucker for a big idea. So that wasn't going to do it for me in terms of, it is a lot of work to write a book. And if I was going to do all that work, then it needed to be something I could really be excited about. So in the process, though, of doing all that research on the science of learning, I kept coming up against this idea that thinking isn't really what we think it is. In other words, we imagine that thinking goes on in our heads, and we focus a lot on the brain and getting the brain to work better. But coming from different directions, I kept seeing references to how, no, actually, thinking happens with the body, and thinking is influenced by the spaces we're in, and thinking happens in the interactions between two people. And so it wasn't until I came across the idea of the theory of the extended mind, which actually emerged from philosophy. So you can see how far I was ranging and how very many studies I read to get to this point. But this idea of the extended mind, which is that we don't just think with the brain, we think with all these outside the head resources, and that it's actually the stuff outside our brains that makes us smart. And that was a big idea that I could really get excited about.
I feel you so strongly on this. Not to get into my stuff again, but I did something very similar. The book that I just turned in about how minds change is started out about social change. I wanted to understand how same-sex marriage went from being 61% opposed to 61% in favor, and about it took about 12 years total. But it was this creep that had happened many times. It like that there was be this almost about to happen, then not almost about to happen, and then it just went and exploded. And I wanted to understand that at the level of neurons and psychology, not political science. And I discovered very quickly what you were getting into, which is the science and psychology of learning, updating our priors, assimilation and accommodation, all that stuff. And that started years and years of going, oh boy. And but I'd already sold the book, and they were like, you have to write it. So 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 that's, I feel you very strongly. This is such a cool idea. I love another thing I like about your book is I was not on board at the beginning. I was like, come on. And that's always fun for me, because I'm reading the first page and I'm like, okay, I'll give you a second. And then like the second page, I was like, okay, I see what you're saying. And then by the started putting in examples, I was like, well, damn it, she's right. So,
Well, I'm glad I could convince you. I didn't know you were a doubter.
well, I just want to but I understood I just didn't understand the premise like I thought I did. I had made a wild assumption that was not the actual argument you were making. So let's start out with that. You open the book with a line, use your head. We say that all the time. And you refer to something called a neurocentric bias. What is a neurocentric bias?
A neurocentric bias is the way all of us, society, kind of idealizes the brain, glorifies the brain. I would even say fetishizes the brain. I mean, if you look at how the brain is literally visually depicted, it's often this sort of glowing orb, like it's some kind of sacred object or something. And you hear people say, and I'm talking about like popular science books and presentations, that the human brain is so extraordinary. It's so amazing. It's the most complex object in the universe. And what happens is that when our own brains don't work so well, which happens, we assume that, well, it must be I got a bum one, because the brain's so amazing. But in fact, the biological brain is very limited in what it can do. I mean, it's a biological organ. It evolved to do certain things very well, but not to do the things that we ask of it, in our complex, knowledge-centric modern society. And so there's this gap between what we think of, how we think of the brain. And I always think the brain must have like a really good PR agent, like it gets really good press, like it's really always being praised. And yet the real scientific story of the last 20 years, if you look at the research, is all that scientists have learned about the brain's limits in terms of attention and motivation and persistence and memory. And we kind of know this, right? I mean, like our brains let us down all the time, but we still have this idea that the brain is so powerful on its own. And that's just not the case. It's actually, the brain actually needs a lot of help. And so what my book is about is getting more skillful at recruiting that assistance and getting better at thinking outside the brain instead of relying on the brain alone.
Oh yeah, I love this.
That's my cat.
Cats are okay. It's post-COVID interviews allow for cats, and I'm very okay with that. My own will try to come in here eventually. What's your cat's name?
Leroy.
Leroy.
Or when he's feeling fancy, Le Roi.
That's good. My cat's name is Simon. I appreciate cats with proper names. Um,
Right.
this reminded when I was reading this, the opening of your book. It reminded me of something that was in a uh, a book about cultural cognition I read a while back with by Hazel Marcus. The title of it escapes me,
Yes.
but I do remember
Culture clash, maybe.
that's
Or clash, just
it's
clash.
Clash.
Something
Yes,
like
I
that.
met I
Yeah.
met
Yeah.
Hazel at some conference at some point, and then got her book, and there's this bit in it about in a lot of Western thinking that the lineage goes back to the Greeks. There's this attempt to sort of disassemble everything into its component parts, reductionism, and sort of watchmaker ourselves. And the thinking of
Mm.
the brain in that way sort of leads to a lot of these ideas that you're busting. But then there's this Eastern thing, which is that's her like bread and butter is the difference between how we abstract out what we are using different cultural lineages. And in a more
Mm.
Eastern way of looking at it is to think of systems as being interconnected and being permeable. And she was saying you would think of a plant in an Eastern frame as being a continuous system between the sun and the atmosphere and the nutrients and the
Mm-hmm.
soil. And the plant is that entire system being manifested in
Mm.
this particular way that we've decided to pay attention to. And
Mm.
whereas a more Western way of looking at it is thinking of the plant as an individual entity that must be studied and put under a microscope, and there's a border around it, and everything outside that border is not plant, and everything inside of it is plant.
Right. Right.
I was
Right.
thinking this very strongly reading your introduction. This concept could be applied to the brain. I want to see if you just agree with this, that there's a way of looking at it, which is like in this box is mind, and then outside this box is not mind. And we use the brain as that box. But you could do the same thing with the plant all the way up to the sun system, which is everything that the brain interacts with is also mind
Mm-hmm.
because it's one continuous system. It evolved in that system, and it's got to be an interplay and a symbiosis and a permeability and all this other stuff. Am I on the right track here?
I think you are actually, and I'm glad that you referenced Eastern thinking because someone who read an advanced copy of the book said to me just recently, your book has a real Buddhist flavor,
Yeah.
which really delighted me because I've been very personally deeply influenced by Buddhism, but there's no reference to Buddhism in the book. But I think that what comes through is this idea that we are not bounded, fixed, sealed off, separate individuals. We're part of a whole ecology. And of course, another part of that Western style of thinking that you mentioned is that we separate the brain from our own
Mm-hmm.
bodies, not just from the world around us, but from our own bodies, as if like there's some, disconnection between the head and the rest of the body. And that's a mistake. I think that's a really serious mistake. I think it's a mistake that causes a lot of pain and suffering in our education system, in our workplace, in our daily lives. And so, if anything comes out of my own work on this book, I'd like it to be a process of reconnecting those things
Mm-hmm.
that we've as you say, it's the Western style of thought to separate and divide and categorize and parcel out, and there are some benefits to that. I mean, that's a lot of what science does is take things apart and study each part individually. But I think we're seeing the limits of that approach, and what we need to do now is bring those pieces back
Mm-hmm.
together. And in particular, what I'm saying in this book is that we need to remember that the brain is not operating in isolation. It's operating in a body, in a physical space, in relationship with other
Mm-hmm.
people, and that's where our focus should be, not on the brain as this isolated organ.
Yeah, well, I've felt your Buddhism coming through because it was because I feel like there is a lot of value in thinking systemically, and strangely enough, thinking about thinking systemically is also very valuable. Um,
Mhm.
the and you mentioned, as you start out, the attention. I got my notes right here. The attention to memory and uh, abstract concepts, persistence with challenge. These are things that we have noticed are quite limited. In fact, I've been able to I paid off my student loans telling people that. But there are other things that brains can do very well, and but you bring up this really interesting TED Talk worthy motif, which is as the world's problems grow more complex. I'm paraphrasing you. The brain grows more unequal to the task of solving them. Let's unpack that for a second.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's we're approaching a crisis point
Mm,
here, to put it bluntly, which is the complexity of the world we live in, the world we have created is outstripping our ability to manage it. And just leaning on the brain is not going to cut it anymore. Because, and I think, even our experience over the past year of the pandemic, it shows us that in the sense that we've all been brains in front of screens for a year, right? And it's not as if our brain, there's this ideology out there that the brain is like a muscle, and you just need to work it harder and it bulks up and it'll get ever more powerful. I think we've seen the fallacy of that over the past year because we've all been working our brains like crazy and we're exhausted, we're distracted, we're dispirited.
hmm
This is not the path to thinking more intelligently. The path to thinking more intelligently is to ask our brains to do less in a way, or at least ask it to play a different role.
hmm
And the way I think about that is that we should think of the brain less as a workhorse and more as like an orchestra
hmm
conductor. I mean, of course, the brain is still involved. I mean, I'm not in any way saying that the brain isn't important or isn't central, but what we ask the brain to do, we can conceive of that differently. And when we think of it as a conductor, as kind of like the place where all these different resources are being pulled in and organized and dispatched as skillfully as possible. That's how we want our brain to operate, not as this donkey that we just keep lashing, until it like keels over and
Yeah.
dies, which is what we've been
Well,
doing.
I mean, this is something that I jam out on all the time. The idea that you say in the book, like you talk about them as biologically secondary characteristics. Like
Yeah,
we clearly, and this has been a line this has been a foundation and a framing that's been around for a while. And I will fight to the death to keep it in the world. It's still
mm,
very plainly obvious that we are a social primate that evolved to do a certain thing, and then we built it. Like it took 66 years to go from the uh, Wright brothers to being on the moon.
mm,
It took roughly a million years to develop facial recognition within the social
mm,
primate brain. We evolved pretty
mm.
slow when it comes to updating the wet works of the brain, but
Right.
we're in this environment that is moving super fast, faster even than culture can keep up with it. So
Right.
I remember my textbooks in high school in South Mississippi, which you have to grade me on a curve in that regard. But there was a, I mean, that we were using textbooks from the 70s and 80s that still were saying, "What is DNA?" Like what is where does the moon go
Uh,
at night? No, they weren't that bad, but it's a very
mm,
the textbooks update slowly, the culture updates as fast as it can. But we're seeing right
mhm.
now a generational spread across Zoomers and Millennials and Gen X and Boomers, where within their silos there are things that are hard to communicate back and forth across these worlds. Like
Right.
we're in the middle of a cultural such a rapid cultural like surge that you have to modulate your references in different social environments. You have to modulate if this joke will land in different social environments. You have to modulate if I can refer even to this song in a different social environments. That's just pop
Totally.
culture. The idea of having to um, worry about ideas like the global financial marketplace and
Climate
climate
change.
change, international
Yeah.
disputes. Are
Yeah.
these UFO things actual real UFOs, or is that a trick of the camera?
Mm.
Was the election stolen? Is the Earth flat? We are having this epistemic crisis that you were commenting on in a sort of orthogonal way, but the you're talking about like physics and calculus. The brain doesn't just like emerge. We have like a I know I'm going on, but I'm very passionate about this. We have a module in brain systems for identifying faces. And
Hmm.
so we were born with some things that are real useful. We're not born with a physics module or a calculus module. Uh, um, and you talk about marketplaces and other things, and you call these biologically secondary characteristics. And you say that the demands of life may actually have reached a point where we are exceeding uh, our cognitive capacity to deal with certain very complex problems. And you even mentioned that IQ may
Hmm.
have arced and leveled off. Please,
Yeah.
please unpack some of this stuff that I went on about just now.
Sure, sure. Well, I'll start with that fascinating idea of biologically primary and secondary abilities. And that's an idea put forth by David Geary, who is a professor at the University of Missouri. And he's saying, look, there are certain things that the human organism evolved to do and to learn how to do very easily. We all pick up our native language, for example, as tiny children, just by being around people who speak that language. We don't even need to be explicitly taught that. We're all good at navigating through a three-dimensional landscape and finding our way back home because that's pretty key to survival. And we're all good, well, not all, but a lot of us are good at interacting with other people and as you say, things like recognizing faces and feeling and sensing what other people are feeling, that kind of thing. We don't have to be taught that, but the reason we have school, formal systems of education, is that that's not the case for things like, well, for things like reading and writing. We have to be deliberately and very intentionally taught that, and that goes even more so for things counterintuitive kind of bodies of information like physics. And I think what we've forgotten is that the brain can so effortlessly and so effectively do these things like use the body, navigate through space, interact with other people. And instead of leveraging those human strengths, we insist on turning everything into an abstract, a process of abstract thinking and learning, which we're actually not that good at. I mean, there's this fascinating body of research on physics education, and I keep referring to physics because it's kind of the paradigmatic example of something we didn't evolve to learn because it's so very counterintuitive, and it took human beings a long time to even figure out how it works. And we have to recapitulate that process every time a student learns physics. But there's this fascinating body of research in physics education that shows that many students who take a semester of physics taught in the conventional way, they understand physics less well after a semester of being taught physics. Yeah, like they were better off before they entered the classroom. So what can we do about that? In the extended mind, I talk about how what's lacking in conventional physics instruction, which is usually taught via lectures and textbooks, is a physical embodied experience of the forces we're talking about, of the forces that are being learned about in physics. And without that, it's just words and it makes no sense to students and they don't get it. And even if they can churn out an A on the test, they haven't really deeply understood it. And what's missing is that physical embodied experience, which is how humans have learned, across millennia. It's just our particular culture that's created this thing called the classroom where you sit and listen to someone drone on for 60 minutes.
And now we take a break from our program for a word from our sponsors. And now we return to our program. I'm David McRaney. This is the You Are Not So Smart podcast. We're talking to Annie Murphy Paul, who wrote a book called The Extended Mind. We're jumping right back into the conversation about schooling, formal education and schooling. Well, I am have I'm duly fascinated or compelled by the idea that we are born into this world and have to be bootstrapped and like, okay, let me catch you up to where we are in the story so far. There's
Right.
that.
There's a lot.
And then
Right.
and then there's a point where you're like, okay, wait, there's just too much. Let me sum up some of this. And then on your own time, maybe you can focus on one of these things. And
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
that's a beautiful and strange thing that's true about being a person. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but then there's also this like other thing you hit on about these systems have become much more complicated than you could. They're so complex at this point. We may have reached a point where no one person can understand any system in totality. So
That's
we
right.
need lots and lots of very thin sliced expertise to understand even something as simple as like how to get coffee from this place to your mouth. Like so everything at some level has to be the YouTube explainer like level of understanding, and you have to accept that. Um, uh,
It also means we have to learn to think better with other people,
yes. Oh
right?
my God.
Because
Yes.
no one person can hold all that information and understand all that expertise. So we have to get much better at sharing our expertise with each other and making our expertise explicit to other people instead of holding it in our heads. That's a key
Oh,
point, I
good. That's
think.
this is what we do for a living. So this is the science
Yeah.
communication is more important than ever. Do you hear that? People who pay people who do that. The I want to talk about these two
Here,
ideas,
here.
and then we'll get into your sort of your finer points. You talk about how this came to be, this sort of conception of everything is in the brain, and the brain,
Mm.
and if you want to do better at life, make brain better. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the you talk
Right.
about computers being this useful but now problematic metaphor, and then this second wave of what if we talked about it more in terms of building a muscle and having growth and grit. So if you could
Right.
unpack those two things, I'd love to hear about how it came to be that we got this sort of strange shared idea about it all's got to be in this brain thing.
Yeah, well, if you wanted to go way back, I think we'd be talking about Rene Descartes and the
Mm,
idea that that mind and body are separate, and I think that therefore I am. But then fast forwarding to the middle of the last century when the first computers, mainframe computers, were developed, it was really interesting looking into that history. That at first, when these hulking giant computers that could calculate numbers, and they're not nearly as powerful as this laptop I'm using right now, but at the time they seemed obviously absolutely amazing. And what's interesting is that when they were written about in news accounts, people said, "Oh, this is an electronic brain. They compared it to a brain." But then very quickly that metaphor got turned around and we started saying, "Oh, our brains are like a computer." And that is a useful metaphor to an extent, but it's also a very flawed metaphor. It's flawed in the sense that a computer doesn't have friends. It doesn't relate to other people. It doesn't really care if other people are around. A computer doesn't operates exactly the same way, whether this laptop is open on my desk like it is right now, or if I took it to a park and was outside in the green and the fresh air. My brain would be working very differently in those two settings, but the computer's like whatever. It's all the same. And a computer doesn't have a body, which is a very interesting direction that artificial intelligence is going now. For many years, the idea was that what was important was the information processing aspect, and that if you just got enough power in that regard, artificial intelligence could solve all our problems and become smarter than we are. But the direction it's going now is very interesting. It's realizing that something like a body is actually necessary to really operate intelligently in our world. So it's a lot of it's that computer metaphor is actually receding in importance, although not in the popular mind. Unfortunately, that still dominates the way we think about the brain, and I think that's a problem. And then, as you mentioned, there's this metaphor that came after the computer metaphor, which also has its benefits. That's the idea that the brain is something like a muscle that you exercise, it gets stronger, that is characterized by a kind of grit that you muster from within. But that too has its drawbacks, in part because, as we were talking about, our experience of the pandemic shows us that using our brains a whole lot without a break, without um, getting out of the house and seeing people in person, that does not necessarily promote the most intelligent thinking. So, what I introduce in the book a third metaphor that I hope will catch on, which is that the brain is like a magpie, one of these birds that gathers all kinds of things from its environment, all kinds of crazy things often, like not just twigs and bark, but, wire and plastic drinking straws, and kind of like everything in its environment gets woven into its nest. And that is what our brains are like, is what I'm arguing, that we take the raw materials of our environment and we weave them into our thinking. And that's how thought is constructed.
I like this. I like this a lot. I like to think of myself as a magpie. This is and a lot of sci-fi pops man when you talk about this too. Just as the concept of like we couldn't travel through to other places without taking the Earth with us. Like it's you can't just stick a person in a box and send them away. You have to put it in atmosphere, and there has to be food, and there has to be something for them to think and feel and do. They have to take the thing in which we evolved. The environment in which we evolved has to also go with us, because we are not isolated from it. We are that entire system is us.
We're constituted by it.
So good. And the magpie thing is beautiful in that, like, even if we were to go do all that we would still be grabbing, as soon as we move into another space, we'd be pulling stuff from that space and putting it into ourselves and be like, I would take a little bit of this piece of Mars, I take a little bit of that, and now I'm thinking about red sunsets this
well, when we think of long range space flight too, the biggest concern is people who are separated from nature and the outdoors for a really long time really suffer and really languish, so if we're going to engage in like flights to Mars someday and stuff like that, we have to figure out, literally, as you're saying, how to take the Earth.
Yeah, we are this. I know this. We're getting right back into Eastern. They must thinking on this, but we are a portion of the Earth moving through as an entity. We are a continuous system with all the systems that allow us to continue to eat and not die. So for us to travel to other places, we have to take the system with us. We can't just go as things in spacesuits. But even the spacesuit is the system. Like, inside of it is atmosphere. And I'm going to go on a tangent here. Let me pull back. You talk about all these things, and then you bring in your new construction here, and then you take a second to talk about Clark and Chalmers, who put this out. Who are they, and what do they give us?
Yeah. Andy Clark and David Chalmers are two philosophers who came out with an article in 1998 called The Extended Mind. And interestingly, it was rejected by 3 academic journals before it was accepted by a journal called Analysis. And it later became one of the most cited articles in philosophy. So I like that as a story that's encouraging to all us writers out there. But in this article, they put forth the idea that the mind doesn't stop at the boundary of skin and skull. That actually the example that they used in 1998 was the notebook, the humble notebook. That if you have a notebook that's kind of always within arm's reach, and you use it to make lists and write down ideas and maybe draw a diagram or a flow chart or something, like that notebook is effectively a part of your thinking process and even a part of your mind. And what's interesting is that when the article came out, it was greeted with a lot of skepticism, a lot of derision, actually. And then something funny happened, which was, as the smartphone was introduced and people started using them and incorporating them into their daily lives, this really wacky idea that something outside your head could effectively carry out some of your mental functions started to seem like kind of plausible, And there's another philosopher, Ned Block, who said that the theory of the extended mind was false when it was written, but later became true. like maybe in 2007 when the first iPhone was introduced. So I think technology is the easiest way into understanding the extended mind, because we all know that our smartphones are kind of like mini brains, right? I mean, who remembers phone numbers anymore? Because our phones do that for us. What's even more interesting to me is that there are other resources outside the brain resources that we extend our thinking with. And those include things like, as we've been talking about, the body, physical spaces, the minds of other people. And that's where the really exciting part of the extended mind is for me.
Yes, I love this idea of the notebook and the a calendar and a to-do list and file folders and a bookshelf and clocks and all these things absolutely extend to what the mind is able to do. But you go into some new territory. I'm just going to bump through these one at a time with the time that we have available to us. You start out with interoception. Or interoception. I'm not going to step all over that. What is that? And what are you talking about? And how does this
Yeah.
extend the mind?
Yes. Well, so interoception, it's a fancy word for something we all have great familiarity with, which is gut feelings, feelings that a sense or a thought that doesn't seem to come from the brain, but that seems to well up from the body. And we know that our gut feelings can sometimes inform us in ways that, our thinking mind can't. And so scientists are beginning to study just what this is. And this is the field of interoception research. And it turns out we have, just as we have sensory organs that help us take in information from the outside, like we have eyes, we have ears, we have olfactory bulbs, and we have sense organs on the inside as well that feed us the steady stream of information about what's going on in our bodies. And it turns out that people vary on how attuned they are to their interoceptive signals. Some people, for example, are able to hear their own heartbeats or to sense their own heartbeats. And other people are like, what are you talking about? That's not possible. But it turns out that people who are more attuned to their interoceptive cues are able to make smarter decisions because it's the body is kind of giving them a little nudge when they encounter a pattern or an experience that they've seen before. And because those patterns are so complex, they're not available to our conscious minds, but they're held in our non-conscious in our non-conscious mind, and it's the body that kind of rings a bell to say, okay, you've seen this before, and here's how to react. So if you're more attuned to that, you can use that information to inform your decision. But if you're pushing your internal signals aside and just trying to power through, as we do, that's more of that brain-centric focus, then you're missing out on that source of information and wisdom.
So like I was at the Science Museum in London one time, and I saw they had this very creepy entire nervous system just there to look at and walk around, and it looks like it looks like the flying spaghetti monster, but it looks like a very strange like jellyfish or something. It looks like something from the sea, and I had this ridiculous or if I was in a dorm room and just had a big bong rip, I would have this would not seem ridiculous. This would seem absolutely earth shattering. But I felt like I was like, oh, so like our body's like our body is like this little dollop of the sea that we're taking around, and this Nadarian
with all these tentacles.
Yeah, and we're this jellyfish inside this life support thing, and my body is just a spacesuit.
It's just an envelope.
Yeah. My body is an Earth suit for this seafaring thing that evolved and came out of the ocean, and I was like, and I had these feelings. But I love
that is pretty trippy.
I love it. At my best moments, I think of my best moments just are still bong rip moments. So I like the idea, but when you I'm thinking about what you're talking about here, and like when you see the nervous system, when you see the brain and all of its associated spinal nerves and everything, it extends all the way out. I mean, you can almost see the body in it, right? It's not just stuck in your skull; it extends all the way through you.
Right. No, so thinking is literally a full body experience, but we don't think of it that way. We locate it right up here, and that's cutting ourselves off from all this flow of information that we could be taking advantage of.
Yeah, and you use a term called brainbound. I like this term a lot. I'm going to steal it from you and use it all the time.
Well, I stole it from Andy Clark, so that's
okay.
Only
Good,
fair.
good. What do you mean by brainbound? And as a follow up question, you can just go ahead and roll into your answer. There's a you talk about how not only is there a lot of brainbound thinking, but it seems to also be the basis of education and management and leadership and training.
Yeah.
That you were saying there is no corresponding. This is from your book. There's no corresponding cultivation of our ability to think outside the brain. While we're still talking about interception, like I feel like there's a way to couple that with being brain bound and how odd it is that we start from there when we try to teach people anything.
Yeah. Well, what do we do when we have kids come into a classroom? We have them sit down, stay still, don't talk to your neighbor, don't doodle or do anything to change your space. And that's how we think we should be learning and thinking. And it goes against every impulse, every inclination of ourselves as human beings. And so that's what I mean by brain bound is that we locate thinking in the head,
Mm.
in the brain, and we focus all our energies on brain centric strategies for learning and thinking. And what I'm saying is, and I write this in the book that in doing all the research for this book, I felt like I was acquiring a second education in how to think outside the brain. But that was not something I was ever taught, in all my years of school and college and graduate school. No one ever taught me how to use the internal sensations of my body to inform my decisions. For example, no one ever taught me how to move my body in order to enhance my thinking, or how to move my hands.
Oh yeah, let's get into it. What
Gesture,
moving your
yeah.
body can nudge you toward a deeper understanding. You said that. What do you mean?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that again, the brain did not evolve to think abstractly. We still put everything in these concrete embodied terms, and we can see that even in our language. We use these metaphors, like we say, "I'm reaching for that goal," or "I'm really feeling down today." It's all. And that's not; those aren't just figures of speech. It's because in order to understand something abstract, we have to put it in terms that put it in terms that our body has actually experienced. So, because we think in these metaphorical ways, moving the body can actually prime the brain to think in certain ways. And the easiest example of this to understand is the fact that a lot of us have good ideas when we're walking or running or exercising in some way. For me, it's riding my bike, which I try to do every day. And there's something about that fluid forward motion that primes the brain to think in ways that are dynamic and fluid and creative. And you can even see that in the ways we talk about creativity. We say we're on a roll, or our thoughts are flowing, or when that's not happening, we're in a rut or we're stuck. So moving the body can actually get a process started whereby the brain follows its lead, which it's reversing the usual arrow of causality, because usually we think, oh, the brain tells the body what to do, but actually this is the brain this is the body sort of leading the way.
I super dig this a whole lot. The especially back in with embodied cognition studies that
Mm-hmm.
always freaked me out before I had a different construct of how anything worked. The at that time the feeling, the idea that your thoughts could be affected by holding something hot or cold, or
Mm-hmm.
walk are getting up and walking over here versus somebody who doesn't get up and walk over here, seemed nonsensical to me because I was still very brain bound, as you would put it. But
Mm-hmm.
and now with your book, I'm even more like I feel even more enlightened. Oh, so hey, thank you for enlightening me, by the way.
Oh, you're
Thanks
really
for all that
welcome.
enlightenment.
Thank you.
What I am
You're
a
welcome.
super hand gesturer, and this is why this sucks so much for me personally because I need a space where I can do this constantly, like Jeff Goldblum. But you have a whole chapter about this, about gestures with hands
Mm-hmm.
can bolster our memory and other things. Tell us about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what's so fascinating about gesture is that it turns out that our newest ideas, our most cutting edge and most advanced ideas, they often show up first in our hand gestures. And that's before we can really put them into words. But then when we express them spatially through gesture, we can use that kind of self-generated information. I mean, we're putting it out there. We're reading it off our hands. We can
Mm.
use that to inform our verbal accounting. So, and what's so
What you
odd
saying
is
is
that
like a feedback
gesture.
loop with our own hand gestures?
Exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
And what's so odd is that, again, this brain bound bias we have is feeds into this idea that gesturing is kind of gauche, or it's like it's just hand waving and it's distracting, and you should really, someone who's under control and in possession of themselves isn't waving their hands all around, when actually gesturing is a visible component of thinking. And when we tell kids, for example, fold your hands in your lap, or don't move around so much, we're really impeding their thinking processes.
This makes so much sense. I mean, when the brain, okay, if we were to stay brain bound and be a brain in a jar,
Hmm.
uh, the brain references the last thing it did to make sense of the next thing it's going to do, and is constantly referring back
Hmm.
to all of its actions at the neural level without before it incorporates body stuff. So uh, it makes sense to me all of a sudden that the if I was to it would also, if you add gestures to its repertoire, that it will then also reference the gestures and feedback loop on that, which means that like I can keep doing concentric circles out, that everything I
Yes.
do is becomes feedback into the next thing that I do in the chain of processing. So it makes, yeah, my entire environment is part of my thinking. I understand your thesis fully all of a sudden.
You've had a revelation. Yeah, I really like that word loops, because it turns out that is how thinking happens best, is being passed in and out, into the brain, out of the brain, back into the brain. Making those concentric loops, as you said, is how thinking works best. And those loops don't just have to be gestures and movements. They can also be passing it through the minds of other people.
Mm,
It could be passing it through physical space, so that you put it out, on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard, and then you think about what's on the whiteboard,
yeah.
but that's not, we usually, again, the brain bound model has thinking happening just in here. And so we're missing out on all the fruitful benefits of creating those loops and making those loops happen as often as
Yeah, I
possible.
mean, even we like with, I mean, with a book, you know this intimately. Like uh, if at some point the book's smarter than you are about the topic, about that topic, and
Hopefully,
like
yeah.
like I have had this experience of like, well, let me go look at the book to see what I said about that, or
Mhm, mhm,
I
mhm,
need to reference my own book before this interview. I need to remember
mhm,
I need to remember
mhm,
what this is. At some point, there's no way you can keep all that in one. I mean, you're going to be able to refer to it as best you can, but the
mm.
book is that is a gigantic feedback mechanism for referring back to all the things you thought, felt, and experienced in creating that one giant argument. That's the value of journaling every day. I more
Mm.
often discover what I think about something, or have epiphanies through journaling or through taking notes, than I do through anything else. I
Yes.
don't get the same kind of epiphanies with my fingers interlaced behind my head in bed when I'm looking at the ceiling going, yes, 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 yes. It's
Right.
more, I have to be doing something and then referring back to the thing, uh,
Right.
which is
And that kind of
awesome.
that kind of offloading, that gets the mental contents out of your head, so that you don't have to keep it in mind anymore. You can inspect it with your senses. You can, if you put it on
Hmm.
post-it notes, you can actually physically move it around and basically turn your ideas into objects that you're manipulating. Again, this is what the brain evolved to do. We didn't evolve, as you say, to just sort of ponder the universe. We evolved to make stuff and grasp stuff with our hands. And so the more we can turn ideas and abstract thoughts into concrete objects in the world, the better we can think about them.
Um, there's this thing that I want you to wax poetic about, which is natural
Hmm.
spaces. This is a chance for an expert science journalist person who's been obsessed with the thing for a long time to really put down some practical, prescriptive, useful thoughts about this thing that feels. I never know how to approach this. I want to approach it without skepticism and without cynicism, and I have felt awe and experienced some great natural experiences. And coming from a very rural part of the world that's very into outdoor lifestyle, I don't know. I to see it in your book was like, and I want you
Mm,
to tell us a little
mm,
bit about what this offers
yeah.
us when it comes to mind expansion.
Yes. Well, writing about our experiences in nature is a little bit of a different challenge than other parts of the book because I don't have to convince anybody that it feels good to go
Hmm.
outside and look at trees and be among the green, expanses. And what I set out to do instead in that chapter was to explain in scientific terms why that would be the case. That it's not just a kind of mushy gushy, feel good tree hugging, like, oh, we are one with nature. There's actually really hard scientific evidence for why nature has that effect on us. And it has to do again with how our brains evolved, that we evolved outside. Our really sort of housebound life is a very recent, and car-bound life is a really recent invention. And our forebears lived a life that, as one ecologist put it, would look to us like a camping trip that lasts a lifetime. Like they were they were
I
outside
like
their
that.
whole lives. Yeah, so we evolved to process the kind of sensory information that is present in abundance in nature. And that kind of sensory information is really different from the kind of sensory information that we encounter either inside in built interiors or in cities and really highly built up and constructed kind of environments. And those latter kinds of environments, the man-made environments, they have a lot of hard edges, they have a lot of sudden movements, they have a lot of loud noises. They're very draining to our
Hmm.
attention, our attentional system. They take a lot of intense focus to navigate and to make our way through. Nature is the opposite. It's nature is full of stimuli that produce what psychologists call a state of soft fascination. I really like that term, that because I think we all have like sort of zoned out when you're watching the waves in the ocean or watching the wind rustle the leaves of a tree. And we know that we do enter this kind of relaxed yet still kind of alert state when we're in nature. And what that does is it replenishes our attentional capacity. And what I noticed since I have done this research is that we focus so much, we talk so much about how do you spend your attention, how do you direct your attention, how do you control and manage your attention, but we talk about how we spend it, but we never talk about how we fill up the tank.
Hmm.
We never talk about replenishing that resource that we're so concerned with. How and where are we
I
directing
love this
it?
so much. I love this so much.
And the way to refill the tank is to go
You're
outside
making me lean
basically
back
and
in my
spend
chair.
some time outside.
Um, the the right before COVID, I was invited to a retreat to where everybody had to give like a little 10-minute lecture, but the other 3 days of it we just hung out outside, at campfire at night, just farting around during the day,
Sounds nice.
and it was great. It
Yeah.
was right before COVID, like it was right before. It was like 2 months
Mm,
before, uh, and but I remember everyone after that having this like, I don't understand why this is so good. Like everyone's
mm,
like, I feel
mhm,
more grounded, centered, and more authentically myself, and more able
mm,
to parse what is and is not important in my life than I ever have before. And it only took four
mm,
days in the wilderness.
mm,
Why? And then all of us were trying to figure it out.
mm,
But through your chapter on this in the book, I was like, oh, that's probably it.
mm,
Which, so
mm.
thanks for solving that mystery. And I think that's really good.
Oh, you're welcome.
But it's also
I even
prescriptive.
talk
It's
about
prescriptive. It's great.
the right. I even talk about the 3-day effect, which is what you guys must have been experiencing, that, even a few minutes outside can have this effect on our attention. But when we really are able to spend extended time in the outdoors, like ideally like 3 days or more, then there are really more substantial mental changes
The
that
3 day
happen, which
effect.
sounds like
All right.
3-day effect. Yeah, that may have been what you're experiencing.
Annie Murphy Paul, is that I want
An
to,
excuse
uh,
to go on a
yes,
3-day
I am
trip.
now going to say, I'm now going to add this to my dogma, which is once a year I have to spend 3 full days in nature from now on. And
Mm.
if anyone
Mm.
asks why I do that, I'm going to reference this conversation in your book.
Yes, it's science.
It's it's science.
Yeah.
That's what I'll say first. And they, what do you mean? Then I'll
Yeah.
tell them. Uh,
Right.
um, as a final question, because but I want you to know I love this work, and I love that
Oh,
I love
thanks.
any book that insists upon itself. I love any work, any creative effort that insists upon itself. So I loved
Hmm.
that you're telling me that you didn't brute force this book, that it emerged from the
Mm,
chaos, that you extracted it
very
from the veil
much.
of ignorance. Um, I love books like that. I mean, I feel it makes me feel more like it's a living entity
Mm.
you're its attending spirit who ushered it into the mortal realm. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
the you
It was just like that.
it was just I it is books are so different after they're out there, aren't they? And halfway through this, I'm sure you had considered spending more than 3 days in the wilderness. Uh,
Yeah, as soon as it comes out, I'm off.
yeah.
I'm backpacking.
Um, the last part of the book is all about people and collaborating, referencing experts, collaborating with colleagues, and then just groups, thinking at the group level with other groups. Let's just mush
Yeah.
all that together into one big ball and tell us some fun stuff about that so people will go buy the book and read the details.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to reference evolution one more time and point out that human beings we evolved to think with people. And yet so often we engage in our thinking alone, and that leads to a lot of problems. In fact, I write in the book about how there's these cognitive biases, which I'm sure you've thought about and read about and talked
Never
about,
heard of
which
it. Tell me about what these are.
like if anyone out there's read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, the idea is that the human brain is riddled with all these cognitive biases which get in the way of clear thinking. And there's some really interesting work in cognitive science that suggests that actually that's just a problem of the brain thinking alone. That when we think
Mwah.
with other
I am giving you.
people, a lot of those biases disappear.
Mwah, mwah,
Yeah.
mwah. This is huge. This is there's a whole chapter in my book devoted to that one thing, which is I
Oh.
felt like it was important that I destroy everything I had built up into this point, because
Mm.
and I want you to finish your thought, but I just want to jump in and say
Yeah.
I'm so happy about this. Hugo Mercier, Dan Sperber, all their work. Yes,
Yes,
yes, yes, yes,
yes.
yes, 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 yes.
Yes, love those, love their
I've
work.
hung out with
Yes.
Mercier quite a bit for my most recent work. Um,
Oh, wow. I can't
and
wait to read
it's
this.
so
Yeah.
good. And the fundamental thing, which is that I spent a whole chapter destroying my last two books and then my podcast in a sense that everything when it comes to biases, fallacies, and heuristics that goes into pop psychology, almost all that work, all those things we can say, hey, look at this person doing this thing. Uh, Almost all of it, the effects are mitigated by just letting people talk to other people, and but just run the
Right,
study again and
right.
let people talk to other people. So
Yes.
I'll stop there. Please go on.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say that and here's a way to put that into action, which is social activities like storytelling, arguing and debating, teaching other people, they engage cognitive processes that remain dormant when we're just alone in a room thinking by ourselves. So the more you can engage in those kinds of activities, and they're fun, right? I mean, it's fun to hang out with other people and do those things. And I think it's a shame that we've really excluded those kinds of activities for the in large part from formal education and from the workplace, and we expect people to sit at their desks and think alone, and we're not even getting the best results that we could when we arrange things that way. So leveraging our social nature as human beings, leveraging that instead of trying to push it aside and say, oh, social life is over here and academic and professional work is over here. When we're working, when we're learning, we're serious, and we're not social butterflies. Actually we should be taking advantage of all our strengths as social beings and bringing that into the learning and working processes to make them better.
Yeah. You got any advice about how we can start?
Well, you could look for somebody to argue with, which you're not arguing with anybody on your show, but the exchange of ideas, I'm sure, has probably helped you think a lot
I
better
I
over
am
the many years
I am
you've been doing
cheating
this.
at this game. I mean, I have found a scam, which is I get to anything that's interesting to me, I get and ask them on the show, and then now I have a conversation
Mm-hmm.
with them, and naturally something comes out of it that I would never have thought of on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got this nice little brain trust over at NYU that I bounce ideas off of. There's nothing like it. Journalists are running a big scam where they get to talk to people who are smarter than them all the time, and then they come up and then they make them come up with ideas for projects, and it makes them seem really smart.
Yeah, it sure beats working for a living.
I love the idea that debate is stifled by the fact that a certain kind of thinking remains dormant when you're thinking alone.
Yeah, kind of gives you hope, right, for humankind if we can just
Oh, I'm an extreme
talk to each other.
I'm an extreme Pollyanna. Don't even I will always
Yeah.
fight people who want to be pessimistic. I think we're going to be fine. Everybody gets to live through something weird. We're living through mega weird. We get we're living through technological
no kidding.
advancement and plagues and epistemic crises and all the rest. We get it all. We're going to get drones and self-driving cars and AI. We get to live through a
Right.
really weird time. So it's fine.
Well, that goes back to the idea that the world is really too complex for us, or at least for our biological brains to comprehend.
Yeah, we might be the last
on their own.
We might be the last few generations to be considered like the ancients, which I'm totally think that's super rad.
The elders.
Yeah, we're the elders of the next phase, and I think that's super rad. So whatever you write,
Okay.
you're creating.
Yeah.
Listen, Annie, you're these are the tomes of the ancients. Like we're the last for the AIs, for the centaurs and the AIs to refer back to the
Right.
elders. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and also your patience with all the technological stuff.
Oh, you're welcome.
I love this. I'll promote
Thank
it heavily. I think you're a fantastic journalist, and I love all of your work. I would love to collaborate with you in the future. And just thanks for being.
Me too, David.
Thank you for being Annie Murphy Paul. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. This was fun.
That is it for this episode of the You're Not So Smart podcast. For links to everything that we talked about, head to you'reNotSoSmart.com. For all the past episodes, go to SoundCloud or Stitcher or Spotify or iTunes or Omni or you'reNotSoSmart.com. Follow me on Twitter at David McRaney. Follow the show at NotSmartBlog. Also on Facebook, it's /YouAreNotSoSmart. And if you would like to support this one-person operation for now, help make it better, help pay for transcription and other features, go to patreon.com/youareNotSoSmart. Pitching in at any amount gets you the show ad-free, but at the higher amounts, you get posters, t-shirts, signed books, and other stuff. The opening music is Clash by Caravan Palace. This music is by Banjo Apocalypse. Hey, you want to really help the show? Tell everyone you know about it. Talk about it on social media, share links, get into arguments, use my stuff as ammunition to make your point, and please, check back in about 2 weeks for a fresh new episode.